So we're on the road again. We're in First Chronicles here. This is the last of the books that the English and the Greek Bible split into twos that are just one. Remember, First and Second Samuel really are just the book of Samuel. First and Second Kings are just the book of Kings, and that's the same with First and Second Chronicles. We have them as two books, but they're one, the Chronicles. It's interesting. We get our name Chronicles from the Latin Vulgate, but I put up the Hebrew name of the Bible. So in the Tanakh, that they call it, anybody want to do it, they can. I figured I'm not even going to try to pronounce that word right of Hebrew. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Greek word or the Latin word because I'd butcher them. So, but I got the meanings of them. In Hebrew, the word means, or the name means the word of the day, the words of the day, or the matters of the day. Because it's looking at explaining the history of Israel, the days of Israel. The Greeks, when they translated it from Hebrew to Greek, they changed the name, and they changed it to, it's a Greek word that means things left out or omission. I don't like that name because it's really not a valid name. Well, not every story in Chronicles addresses every story that's in Kings and Samuel. A lot of them are, and the highlights are. The difference between Chronicles and Samuel and Kings is the emphasis of what's being addressed by God. So, but they changed the names to things left out. And then in Latin, of course, they changed it again. And this is where we get the name. The Latin name for the book in the Latin Vulgate is Chronicles. It means Chronicles. So we took that into the English when they translated it to English, and they used the lackey's name, Chronicles. I don't want you to get confused or misunderstood, because I've had a lot of people who think this is the way it is, and it's not. You've heard of the telephone game where someone whispers in someone's ears, and as they whisper in each ear and it passes from one ear to the next, to the next, to the next, it's completely different at the end of the telephone game. And I've had that accused of the Bible before, that we've translated the Bible so many times that it's not what the original was meant. And that's not true at all with the Bible. What happens is the Greek Septuagint, so the Hebrew Bible's the Tanakh, it's written in Hebrew, and they translated that in, 300 or so BC, and they did it into the Greek Septuagint. After Alexander the Great conquered the known world, Greek became a predominant language. In fact, they spoke Koine Greek when Jesus was walking the earth. And they translated the Septuagint from Hebrew. And then when they translated the Latin Vulgate, St. Jerome, and don't quote me on these times, 300 or 400 AD, after the cross, he translated into Latin, because Latin became a very, very popular language at the time. But he did it from Hebrew too. So sometimes you think that we translated it from Hebrew to Greek, then to Latin, then to German, then to French, and then finally English. That's not true. Every one of the translations have access and is used access to the original Hebrew. Now, that doesn't mean some of the translators haven't used the Hebrew and then compared it to what they did in the Greek Septuagint and compared it to what they did in the Latin Vulgate. But the source of it was the original Hebrew. So don't ever let anybody tell you about the telephone game and that's what the Bible translated did, and you've lost the true meaning of the original. That's not true at all. But in this case, when they did do it in English, they used the Latin Vulgate's name for it, even though they used the original Hebrew text to translate it. King James, obviously, used the Hebrew, and all the other ones did as well. So that's how we got our name for Chronicles. And of course, we split it in two. And I was going to say, before I flip to my next slide, but now you already know, but, has anybody been to Houston, Texas? Yeah. And what is their newspaper called? The Houston Chronicles. San Francisco, what's their newspaper called? The San Francisco Chronicles. So when we think Chronicles, we don't always think of the Bible book. Sometimes we think of newspapers. Now, I know a lot of us are at the age where we got a newspaper. Most people nowadays don't even get newspapers, right? So.
Doug's dad does.
Huh?
Sure.
Doug's dad does.
The one guy.
Yeah.
He's that one guy.
Still using the trees. Yes. So Chronicles in the newspaper is all about recording the history of the day or the week in a weekly newspaper and so on. This is what Chronicles does as well. You have people writing a book that's looking back on history of what occurred during 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings and recording it. You remember that saying at every one of the kings, I pointed out it when we were going through that. You know, in fact, I probably have it somewhere else, so I won't even bring it up because I can't remember it. Oh yeah, there it is. So that statement down here, it says, as for the other events, add whatever king you want from the south or the north, didn't matter, reigned, and all he did, are they not written in the annals of the king of Judah or Israel? They use those two because they still had them, right? When a lot of these, when this book was written. This book was written, though, when they were in exile. So the Chronicles was written after the Babylonian captivity. So we had the Assyrian captivity that took the northern tribe off. Babylon conquered Assyria and Judah and took them all off. So they're leaving. They're in captivity in Babylon and they're writing the Chronicles. And of course, First Chronicles that we're going to go over today focuses on David, the ancestry of the genealogy of David, and David's preparation to build the temple. And he's going to hand that off, and Second Chronicles is going to take over and start with Solomon and the building of the temple. So, the author's not explicit. It doesn't say anywhere in the Bible who the author is, but once again, much like Kings and Samuel, the tradition, the Jewish tradition is that Ezra wrote it. And the reason is, after Chronicles, we got 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The next book we'll go to is Ezra. And he was a priest, and lots of his writing in his book he's named for, we know he wrote Ezra, are identical to some of the phrases and stuff that are in Chronicles. So it's not a far leap to think Ezra wrote Chronicles as well. But some others of the priests and prophets could have wrote it as well or helped him out, because we're not told exactly. We have 29 chapters in Chronicles, and the time period obviously is going to start out with Adam and Eve, with the fall. It goes all the way back, but it's very, very quick, and we're going to take a look at that. And then, of course, the theme is God's promises endure, throughout his whole word. I wanted to show you this chart because as we're doing an overview and we're looking at Chronicles, sometimes you say, we're reading 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then we read 1st and 2nd Kings, and now we're going to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and you're going to say, but this is a repeat of a lot of the stories I just read. And from our perspective, because of the Protestant Bible, that is true, because we stick them over here in the Protestant, we have them under the historical books, and we have it right after Kings and Samuel. That's not how the Hebrew Bible is organized. And once again, I want to state something that people get confused about. I've talked to people about the order of the Hebrew Bible versus the Protestant Bible, and they say, well, then they're not the same word. Well, no, that's not true. The content of these books are identical. Remember, we said that, we emphasized that for two things. A lot of people get confused because the Hebrew Bible has one book and the Protestant Bible has them in two books. So are they different? No, just different words take different lengths. And then they're in different orders, which throws another curveball. People say, well, they're not the same Bible then, but they are the same Bible because these are individual books we've brought together in a book we call the Bible, right? The book. The Bible just means the book. And just because it's not in the same order in Hebrew does not mean it's not the same content in the scroll, in the books, because they're identical, word for meaning, word for word. But in the Hebrew Bible, they put it at the end. And it makes more sense to them because what they did, of course, they have them categorized into three groups. You've got the law, the Torah, then you got the prophets, and then you got the writings. Jesus even referenced the law, the prophets, and the writings. So he could not condone, but he, endorsed. He endorsed this order that the Hebrew Bible was in because he referenced it and stuff. But they put Chronicles at the end because it's really an overview. Remember when I was saying when we were going through Kings and Samuel, I said to really understand those, you have to understand all of these books too, and all of these as well, because all of them are in that same time period, whether it's during the unified monarchy, the divided monarchy, or the exile. Those are all in detailed, more information in there. So what the Hebrew Bible does is it goes through all of them, and then in Chronicles, it reviews them from Adam, from their very beginning, all the way through. So it makes more sense to them than where we put it in the history books, and then we have a bunch of books after it too. So be thinking like that when we're looking through this. You've seen this chart before, but I just wanted to put it in again. Remember, we have 2,000 years from the fall to Abraham, from Abraham to the cross, 2,000 more years, from the cross to 2033, 2,000 more years. And then we've used this where we're in this 350-year period here. And what Chronicles is going to do is it's going to back up this story all the way to Adam. And it's the first word in the Bible, or in the book of Chronicles, is Adam, and we're going to see that. And it gives us 3,000 years of history. Remember Saul, he became king at what, 1050 BC? And he reigned for 40 years, and then David became king at 1010. So we're right in the middle of this 2,000 period. So when they go back, one of the purposes of Chronicles, especially chapters 1 through 9, is to chronicle the genealogy of David from Adam to David. And that's what chapters 1 through 9 does. So chapters 1 through 9 is going to take us from the fall 3,000 years into the middle of this time period here, at 1010 when David takes a reign. So that's the kind of it's going to cover 3,000 years in 9 chapters, and then it's going to cover the rest of the years in the remaining chapters of Chronicles. So even in the Second Chronicles too. So I kind of wanted you guys to get that framed up in your minds on, once again, where we're talking about, when we're talking about. This kind of breaks it up a little better. It goes, I liked this for a couple reasons. One, it shows some symmetry here where we have the fall. Remember Genesis, we broke Genesis up when we did it, and we broke it up into 1 through 11 because that talked about the 4 events that happened: creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. And then 12 through 50 talked about the relationship. Once again, much like Chronicles, it's condensed for 3,000 years. And then the remaining little history is covered with the rest of the chapters. Genesis did the same thing because Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, those 4 relationships, were the rest of Genesis that we covered. But then we had, after they went to Egypt with Joseph, they had the 400 years of silence, before they cried out and Moses came. And then you have all the way at the end where we're going to take this, the Chronicles is going to take us all the way through the exile to the other end of that. We're going to have another 400 years of silence, right? We're going to have the 400 years of silence between Malachi, our last prophet in the book of Protestant Bible, all the way to Matthew, where Jesus is introduced again. So, and notice it's very busy in here with all the books through a very crunched time period. So, and we're going to go through all these books with an overview, and it's all going to be in this real crunched period of time comparative to the overarching, period of man. Okay. The one word I have for this book is sovereignty, God's sovereignty. I could probably use that for every book. And as I'm stepping through them, I'm thinking, what word? I'm thinking, I'm going to start duplicating my words. I'm trying not to duplicate my words on another book, but I could probably use sovereignty for every book, because God is sovereign through all his truth. This one we have, I just wanted to break it up. We have 1st and 2nd Chronicles here. Today we're going to go chapters 1 through 9, which is the genealogy. Chapter 10, they give Saul 1 chapter. So it's King Saul gets 1 chapter out of his 40 years of reign. And then we go to the rest of it. 11 through 29 is all about David and his preparation for the temple. So we won't go into the second until next week, but that's what we're going to cover today. The first 9 chapters, Saul in chapter 10, and then all focused on David. And the meat of the information is all about David and David's preparation for the temple. I used this picture too. I liked it. I have over here 1 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 1. Adam, Seth, Enosh. If you want to memorize verses, that's an easy one. Everybody always says, if you want to memorize verses, start with John 11:35. It's the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. Yeah. Jesus, and that's an easy verse. If you're trying to check off how many verses you know, there you go. Jesus wept. And here's another one you can grab a hold of. It's 3 words: Adam, Seth, Enosh. That's the verse. And I'm showing you this for a theme, because chapters 1 through 9 we're not going to go through, because if you're reading through the Bible, this is where a lot of people stop, because you're just one name after another after another after another. If you want to see me butcher names, have me read chapters 1 through 9. It is so many difficult names. It makes Kings easy on pronouncing the names because there's so many of them. It goes through from Adam all the way up to David. And what it does is when it goes through these, it tells all of the names of the people. Like we got Adam, it mentions them all. And then a good example is like when we get to Noah. The sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So we have those 3 sons, which is great. But the Bible then goes on to take Ham's descendants and read off a lot of them. But it stops because the main focus of Chronicles is going to go forward with the genealogy that reaches David, and eventually that goes forward to the genealogy that reaches Christ, right? That's the importance here. But we know that genealogy is important even above and beyond the Abrahamic covenant. The Abrahamic covenant was promised to Abraham for the land, that he would be a father of many nations, and the Messiah would come through his lineage. And that's what we care about mostly as believers, is the genealogy that takes it all the way to Christ. But in the Jewish world, they cared about genealogy for a lot of reasons, right? Because you could not claim your land unless you could prove your genealogy. The land was divided up to the 12 sons of Jacob, or Joseph, or Israel. And those 12 sons passed that land on to their genealogy, to their descendants. And you could sell yourself into servitude if you became if you didn't have the ability to pay your bills, you could sell yourself into servitude. But you always at Jubilee got all your land back to your family, but you had to prove it. So they were really focused on genealogy and keeping that true. So when the Chronicles goes through this, they use Ham's descendants and then Japheth's descendants, but the real long one, you get to Shem, because Shem is the Semitic tribes, and that's where then Abraham comes from, right? So it takes it all the way to Abraham. But then every one of these, like I said, when they get to a name, this just shows a little bit of them. These are the 12. But every one of these 12 sons, God takes the genealogy out and then stops at the first generation of them. But when they get to Judah, they take it all the way. So Judah, well, it just shows Judah, David, Solomon. You wish there's chapters in here on the 1 through 9 that are dedicated to Judah, because it takes it all the way, all of his descendants, all of their descendants. So I guess what I'm trying to say is all the names have their descendants in the genealogy out to a point, but the seed that goes to the Abrahamic promise takes it all the way. So that's what you have in the first 9 chapters of this. And I kind of put these together. Chapter 1 talks about Abraham's descendants. It even goes into Keturah, his second wife. Remember, notice how it's Hagar, which was the mistake. You do Hagar with Ishmael, and then his wife Sarah is underneath Keturah, because Sarah's going to go all the way up. But even after Sarah dies, he marries Keturah, and they take her descendants out too. So we have that whole thing of everything we went through in Genesis in just one verse, of names. And then you get to chapter 2, it covers Israel, or Jacob's, and all his sons, focuses on Judah, takes Judah to the end. Chapters 3, the sons of David, and it talks about the ones that were born in Hebron. It talks about the ones that were born in Jerusalem, much like we covered in Kings. They're not just names, but the bulk of it 80-20, I guess. 80% of it's just name. Every now and then, which means it's worth reading, it gives more information about that family. It'll expand upon that and tell us something interesting about that family. But I didn't want to stop there because most of the interesting stuff it tells us about those families, we also talked about in 1st and 2nd Samuel and in 1st and 2nd Kings. So this just reiterates it. But it takes us all the way 4, 5, the Reuben, and then in 6 it does a little ad-libbing. It tells us about the sons of Levite, the priestly, but it takes a pause in 6 because it not only tells us about the Levites. Who are the Levites? They're the ones that are responsible for the temple, right? Now the Levites had a lot of family members, and it's just one family member, Aaron's, that are the priests that do the sacrifices. All the other family members are ones who do other functions, and it adds a little bit to that. Some are responsible for the music, and David puts all of those in charge. So 6 is a little more. You could go back and read that because you're not just going to get names. You're going to get a little bit of story added to that as well. 7 jumps back to a bunch of names. These are Issachar, Benjamin. These are the rest of the sons of Abraham. Of Jacob. And then 8 ends with Saul. So 8 is sometimes stopped when you look at these chapter breakouts, 1 through 9 or 1 through 8. Some people say it's 1 through 8 of the chronology, and because 1 through 8 ends with Saul's genealogy. So we're all the way up right before David on Saul. But 9 actually does some of the genealogy added to that too. I wanted to show this. Like I said, it's hard to teach genealogies. You know, you could, if we were going to go slow through it, we would go with meanings of names. There's some things you can peel the onion back and get some marvelous information about God because names mean something. We don't have time to go through these meanings of all these names, but one of the things I did want to point out in all of these names is the track here. Obviously, we start with Adam. It kind of gives this. I could not find something that you could give a holistic picture of all of them that was so busy you could actually see. This was the best I could do. And it has 2 things I want to show. I want to show that the lineage all the way to David, which is what's important in Chronicles. But that 400 years of silence before Matthew, that's what is important here too. So what happens here is, if you remember, you know, we had the United Kingdom with David, the United Kingdom with Solomon, and then we had the broken up kingdom, the divided kingdom. I shouldn't even try because I always I had it in my head. Rehoboam. I don't know why I can't. That's every week. Rehoboam. So Rehoboam is the first divided kingdom, and then we go all the way down. This is Judah, and then that side is a different family line for Nathan. It's not Israel. It's just a different family line of David's. Jeconiah. Thank you. Jeconiah was cursed. And why this is important to us as believers? Because in this line of David, Joseph comes from the line of Solomon. But Jeconiah was cursed. We read that in Kings. We saw that in this king. No one from his lineage would sit on the throne of David. From this point on, none of these people are eligible, even though they're from the tribe of Judah, you know, from the tribe of from Solomon's lineage. None of them are allowed to sit on the throne of David because the curse God put on Jeconiah. And that's where Joseph's lineage comes from. So Joseph is not eligible to sit on the throne. But Jesus not only has authority to sit on the throne of David because of his adopted father, so the seed that was cursed doesn't pass to Jesus because Jesus was a miraculous birth, right? But Mary's descendant comes from Nathan, Joseph's or David's other son, and so Mary has the lineage from Nathan, and it was not cursed. So Jesus had the blood right to sit on the throne and the legal right, which would have passed to his father, in this case his adopted father, or his real father, the true king, right? God the Father. So Jesus had 3 authorities. God the Father, who's the true king, the legal one, if anybody was to have challenged Jesus it would have been through Joseph's adoption of him, which would have been legal, and through Mary, the birthright. And why that's important, if we camped out here, which we're not going to, I've done it a little with Kim, where I've taken and who's eligible to be this promised, that was first given in Genesis of a Messiah, a Savior coming and crushing the head of the serpent. At first, it's anybody from mankind. And then it keeps on narrowing. This is a drastic narrowing, because in reality, this narrows it down so much. Really, Jesus is the only one that would have been eligible, because you need the legal right and you need the birthright, the seed, the bloodline, right? And now, because everybody after Jeconiah, there's really, Israel would have been saying, no one could be the promised Messiah because of that curse. But God had a way, right? And Jesus actually becomes the only one that ends up eligible. I just wanted to point that out as we were focusing on genealogy. That gets us to chapter 9. Chapter 9 is going to focus on the return. It continues out, like I said, the genealogy. All of Saul's are listed in here. And there's more detail in 9. The reason some people don't put 9 in the genealogy is because there's also a lot more where David starts listing the priests and the Levites. He starts organizing things. We're going to see this theme from 9 through the rest of this book of David organizing and setting up the temple, the foundation to build the temple. We take a little turn after 9, we get to 10, and this is a familiar story we have. The difference between Kings and Chronicles is Kings tells us the good, the bad, and the ugly. It tells us all these stories and failures of David and Solomon and the different failures. Chronicles doesn't do that. Chronicles primarily looks at positive stuff. But there's 3 instances in Chronicles that we're going to see God bring out that are negative. And Saul's one of them. Saul's given this chapter here, and we remember this story. Saul and his 3 sons are fighting the Philistines, and this is where Saul gets mortally wounded, and he wants his armor bearer to kill him. His armor bearer wouldn't kill him, and so he dies, thrust on his own sword. He dies on his own sword. And of course, we know this whole other story which isn't even told in this version of it, where the guy went to David with his sword and all that stuff. We know that all from Kings. This just gives a higher level focus on the end of Saul. And it does it in order to say, there's a couple things here. One, I put verses 13 and 14 here. Saul died because of his unfaithfulness to the Lord. We're not told this information in Kings. We know Saul dies. And it's intuitive to us that he died because God brought judgment, but it doesn't say it. In Kings, it doesn't say it. King gives us the history. But we know from Chronicles, it actually says it. He did not keep the word of the Lord and even consulted a medium for guidance. Remember the witch of Endor that we talked about? He went to the witch of Endor. So the Lord put him to death. Did he kill himself? Yeah, probably. But the Lord put him to death is what Chronicles says. He died because his unfaithfulness to God, his rebellion against God, his seeking mediums, his worshiping other idols. I mean, those things is why he died. And we get that from the story in Chronicles here, which we don't necessarily get unless you dig it out in Kings or in Samuel, actually. Okay. That gets us to the 11 through the rest of them. We're going to kind of go through this now. I'm going to kind of do a high level one on this. So these are the things that happened. David, this is about David's, what is this? This is about David's, David's anointed king. Yeah, so it reiterates that. You remember we saw David in Kings. He get anointed in Hebron first. And he was just anointed over Judah, but then he had to capture Jerusalem. The Jezebites were still in control of Jerusalem. It wasn't called, there was Jezebite, I think, the town, but he named it Jerusalem after he conquered it, the city of David. But he had to conquer that. In Chronicles, unlike Kings gives us a lot of detail in that effort. It goes that Chronicles just mentions this as a fact, a matter of fact. This is what happened. He did it. And it goes into him building up his army, the mighty men. You remember we talked about it, the mighty men of valor that we're doing. This talks about in detail a little bit about, oh yeah, he had men coming to him who could shoot both right-handed and left-handed. The Bible points little things like that out. But basically it's talking about him growing his army in chapters 11 and 12. Then we get to 13. It changes. We did see this story too. This is probably, in my opinion, right or wrong, is the second kind of negative story we get in Chronicles that is also in Kings. They're moving the ark. If you remember, they get a brand new cart. They get oxen that have never worked the yoke before. So they think they're doing right things, but they're not doing it the way it's outlined in Leviticus on how to move the ark. And you have Uzziah there, who it wobbles, he touches the ark, and as soon as he touches the ark, he's struck dead. This story is back in Chronicles, and of course it says after that, after Uzziah's death, David was afraid of God. And David stopped where the ark was, and they put it in Obed-Edom's house, and it was there for 3 months. This is a reiteration of the story that we already seen, and it probably goes into more detail then than it does in chapter 13 here, but it retells this story, and of course it blesses Obed-Edom's house for 3 months. Everything he does is successful. But it sits there and it waits there. I don't think this it doesn't tell us that they bring it to the regular one. So this story is in there, and then it goes to a number of, it changes fast from chapter to chapter. All of a sudden it goes from the ark, they leave the ark there, and boom, they start outlining all of David's successes. It sits there and just outlines his battles, his success. And what I did like, and remember when we were going through Kings, we saw a pattern. We saw a pattern of David going to the Lord in prayer and being successful, and Saul not going to the Lord, or many of the kings as we went through the Kings not going to the Lord. When they went to the Lord, they were successful. Chronicles here points out that David went to the Lord in prayer in everything he did. The Philistines were coming upon him, and rather than he's a warrior king. Rather than him getting his mighty men, which we just left 2 chapters ago, about all these mighty men that were, shooting right-handed, left-handed and all this. And it goes into how many, the numbers and all that. Rather than him just rushing out to war, he went to the temple and prayed. And he prayed, God, do you want me to go up in battle? And God says, yes, go up in battle and you will be successful. So he goes up, and it doesn't just happen once, it happens multiple times. He wins that battle, then there's another battle that's coming upon him. And of course, he goes and he waits and prays to the Lord, and God says, yes, you'll be victorious. So he goes up there as well. So God grants victory to those who trust him. And I hope you've heard me week after week after week emphasize that it's the same for us. If we go to the Lord before we plan something, we stand a good chance of following him if we don't hear ourselves screaming in our head. Yes?
Something just came to mind in all this is how even the commended kings, Israel or Judah, you hear this statement, and they failed to remove the high places.
Yes.
And that's at the core of it, right? It's the competing gods that we all battle and that they battle.
That's very, very true. And of course, Kings looks at that a lot more, right? Because they would tear down the temple of Baal, and they do, and the Asher poles, but they would not take down the high places. All of them, other than Josiah and maybe one other, did they really clean house. And even them, when their next child was taken king, put them all back up. So, but it's true, and it is exactly. In fact, if we were going to sit here on application and go into applications, it's not just tearing down your idols, or let me back up. It's not just going to the Lord in prayer, which is important. That's the foundation of our life, is following God with everything, You know, every step we take, we ask God for insight on what he wants us to do in every area of our life. I know what's that song? Jesus Take the Wheel. And you know, if life was just as easy as a steering wheel that you could give one thing over to God, but life is like a stagecoach with 16 reins on 8 horses, and you're sitting there trying, and you've given God these 5 or these 3 or but you got to give every bucket in our life over to God, you know. And that's what they didn't do in Kings. They cleaned up some areas of their life. They cleaned up their church. It'd be like us being good on Sunday, but Monday through Saturday we're terrors. You know, they cleaned the temple up, but they didn't clean the high places up, right? And that stays. Chronicles doesn't go into those as much because it's almost like a flyover of these events. The events Chronicles talks about are also in Kings, which is why I didn't like the Septuagint's name of omission. You know, it was things left out, because it really doesn't. It's a flyover, and it doesn't give detail, but it hits the high points, and it hits the things that God wants to point out for the purpose of his glory and his watching over the nation, right? So,
And where we should pen our book.
and where we
Don't be unfaithful. Do go to him. I mean, the 3 times that negative is brought up, it's so we can learn from it.
Yes, it is. That's exactly right. So for the Kings, and Samuel and Kings brought up negative because it was history. But you're right, Chronicles purposely brings up those negatives so we can learn from them. You're right. That's a good point. So we had in chapter 12 or 13, them bringing the ark incorrectly. By 15, now it's bringing the ark over properly. So David, he organized the priests. See, David, Chronicles is going to be a lot about organization. David organizing things. Here, he structures it so they're going to bring the ark over to the temple, or they don't have a temple yet, right? To the tent of meetings, because Solomon will build the first temple. So they have a tabernacle, the tent of meetings, but they don't have the temple yet. And David organizes the Levite priests to bring the ark over properly. That's with the poles. No one can touch it. Only a certain family can carry it. And he does all these things. He all through this chapter, and it's going to sound a little repetitive because a lot of the chapters talk like this, but he's going to outline what family of the Levites are responsible for music, which ones are for the sacrifices. Those are Aaron's ones. They're only which ones, the procession, which ones are going to be the gate watchers. All of these things are going to be done. I brought these 2 so 15 starts with 1 and 2 and ends with 29, and I guess I will read them, but you guys could probably, but for those who might not be able to see it on the film. So after David had constructed buildings for himself, he built himself a palace in the city of David. He prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. When then David said, "No one but the Levites can carry the ark of God, because the Lord chose them to carry the ark of the Lord and to minister before it forever." And then it ends with, "As the ark of the covenant of the Lord was entered into the city of David," remember this story too, Micah, daughter of Saul, watched from a window, and when she saw David dancing and celebrating, she despised him in her heart. Remember, this marriage was an alliance between Saul and David. He married Saul's oldest daughter, and we had the story in Kings as well where she started to despise him. But this is the story. I don't like this picture because it shows him in his kingly clothing. The Bible actually says he takes off his kingly clothing and he's in his undergarment, more or less. And he's dancing as they're bringing the ark in there. He's celebrating. And application-wise on this one, I know sometimes we get uncomfortable on how certain people celebrate. Anybody celebrating the Lord, it's okay with me. I don't care what genre they use, the only warning I would give is if you're drawing attention away from the Lord and on yourself, then I have red flags go up. But I like all music, as long as the lyrics are glorifying God. I have some that I like better, but if it's lifting up the Lord, it's good. in my opinion, And then that's true with this. David, he's the king. Yeah, should he have asked, should he have looked more kingly? That's what his wife thought. But no, I mean, if the Lord's making you joyful and you want to raise your hands, sing, whatever, power to you. Let the Lord move in you, and that's my opinion of it. So we get to 16, and the 16 is a song and a praise that David does. So the ark's in Jerusalem. He offers a burnt offering to sanctify the ark in there. The priests move in to start servicing the ark. They have not been doing, when we went through Leviticus and Genesis, Moses was adamant about the sacrifices, how many, when, and all this stuff. They got away from that. They did not do that, right? They were not doing that. So they got back to it. They didn't do it through Judges. And we're going to see later on, they're going to go off into captivity. Well, in fact, they are. They're in captivity. Remember, this book is being written from captivity, and it's to encourage the difference between 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings and Chronicles is while they were in the event, they had these things going on, written about themselves, written about their history, being recorded. This is a person who's writing the book to the people that have been in exile for 70 years. So we're going to find out, why are they in exile for 70 years? And it's because they weren't doing burnt offerings. They weren't doing the Sabbath. They had gotten away from the law. And the Bible explicitly says, I'm going to give the land all the Sabbaths that it missed by taking you guys out of it and putting you in exile for 70 years to make up the Sabbaths that you missed, that you did not give it when you were living in the land. So that's what the timing was. But you got to get to Jeremiah to find that out, because Jeremiah tells us that, right? One of the prophets. And that's the one that Daniel, who's in captivity in Babylon, he's reading the book of Jeremiah, and he goes, oh, Jeremiah says we're going to be in exile for 70 years. We're in the last year of this. So Daniel realizes when he's in captivity that they're in the end of the 70 years, because he's reading the book of Jeremiah, which is in the Bible. And the reason that they're in that exile is because they had not done what David's starting to pick back up again in recognizing the Sabbaths and the burnt offerings and stuff. And 16 expands more on David organizing once again and appointing it. When I'm reading this, I'm thinking, but he already appointed them. But the Bible reiterates he's appointing. And when we get to the numbers, I think there's, like, in one of the rules, and I'll probably get to that later, but I'll say there's 24,000 priests that are set up. There's 24,000 from each of the 12 tribes that are set up to work for 1 week a year. So you have 24,000 people working for 1 week each for 12 months, and then you do it again. So they're working maybe twice a year, 24,000 people and it explains that in one of the future chapters. I don't remember if I wrote it up or not, but.
Well, why do you think that David built buildings for himself before he built tabernacle for the ark?
That's a good question. If you read the story, David doesn't even build his palace. It's the king of Lebanon comes down in honor of David being king and builds his palace for him. David doesn't even build it. It's for him, but in a king, so God put it on the heart of the king of Lebanon to come down with all the materials, the money, and build him his palace. But
David wasn't making that decision.
He did not. And of course, we're going to see here, I think maybe in the next chapter, when David wants to build the temple for God, God says, I never asked for a temple. So even it was customary for a king to have a palace, right? And so that was just the way the world was. And David says, I'm living in this palace. I want to build God a palace, a temple, a huge temple. And of course, we're going to see he's not allowed to do that. But I lost my train of thought. So he didn't build it, but he did one because he was living in one. He says, "Why am I living in this plush place?" And God doesn't have a place like this to live. But God pushes back on him and says, "I never asked for one. I was fine in the wilderness, moving around in the tabernacle and stuff." So, so we get to 17, and he talks a little bit about he wants to build a temple, and we kind of went over this in Kings as well. David wants to build a temple, and Nathan first approaches him, and David says, Nathan's the prophet of the day, and David says to him, "I want to build God a temple." And Nathan goes, "If it's on your heart, do it." So David starts to do it. That night, though, God comes to Nathan in a dream and says, no. Go back and tell David he is not eligible. He's not going to be the one to build the temple. I will use his son, Solomon, to build the temple. And why? We learned before, because of the blood on his hands. And it wasn't just that he killed a person. He was a king of war. God used him in the time and season. And I think the application for us there too is God's using us the way God wants to use us and what we're eligible for. We may want to do this role, but he wants to use us in this way. And when we go to the Lord, we should not go with a preconceived idea on how you can have desires in your heart and put them before the Lord, and he may grant you your desire, but he also may say, "Nope, in this case, your hands are too bloody. You will not be the person." But he allows David. A lot of people say the temple, Solomon's temple, was really David's temple because David did so much prep work. He brought the material. He brought the builders. He brought everything for Solomon just to do the building blocks, And he made the arrangements because Solomon's also, when he builds it, is going to get this material from Lebanon. Lebanon becomes a very good ally of, the nation of Israel as a whole, United Kingdom. But because they bring a lot of their skilled people, a lot of the gold and material down for the temple to be built. So notice in Chronicles, we don't find out that in 17, as you're reading it, and David has that desire, I'm sure you guys already read, but in 22:8 is where we find out why, and it says, "But this word of the Lord came to me, you have shed much blood and have fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight." And it's interesting because God used him. So he's not letting him do what's on his heart for something God used him to do. So that's somewhat uplifting too. I mean, okay, I'm trying to put this in a way that we would understand in our lives. We may have a desire to do something, and it was God who used us in another way, even though we had a desire to do something else for the Lord. I can't think of, I guess if I was thinking, did Billy Graham want to be a preacher? And God used him as an evangelist, right? And God used him in a great way, right? But he wasn't a pastor. He wasn't a flock, taking care of a flock. He was moving constantly around. But God used him in a mighty way. We never know how God's going to use us. And, I love the thing, the law of reciprocity is whatever you sow, you reap. If you sow smiles, you reap smiles. If you sow frowns, you reap frowns. That's in our ministry too. Whatever we sow in our ministry, we're gonna get back. So if we're doing it for God, He's gonna bring the blessing back on you for that particular ministry He has you doing. So 17 finishes out with David planning everything and preparing everything. Then 18 through 20 gets us to, once again, wars. So we had the first wars that he fought. All of a sudden now we have 18, 19, and 20 are different kingdoms. We've got the Philistines, and it talks about the Philistines. When they heard David, remember David was a little boy. Who did he kill? The Philistine Goliath. He killed Goliath. And they never forgot that. So now David's king, and the Philistines come down here on chapter 18, and they're going to attack him, and David and his men defeat them, and they end up fighting other giants too. In fact, one of the giants in the Bible, it said that is Goliath, one of Goliath's brothers, right? So there's more giants to be slayed even after Goliath. and they're victorious over the Philistines, and then a little bit later in the chapters they're over the Moabites, and then a little bit later the Edomites come down and they fight them, and then the king of Aram. In Kings, we saw a lot of these wars, right? Now in Chronicles, it just is rapid fires, boom, boom, boom. When we studied this in Kings, it had gaps of chapters. We'd have a war, and then we'd have 2 or 3 chapters of other things going on in the nation of Israel or Judah, and talking about other kings, and then all of a sudden it would go to another war, another war. This one just rapid fires, war after war, and God and David is successful in all of these wars. That's pretty much this whole chapter, or 3 chapters. Oh yeah, I did put the note in there. Remember the story we went over with that 75 crown, and we had the picture of the crown? It's told in here again too, that David, they conquers that. Joab actually conquers that, and then calls David, and David comes and receives the crown and wears the crown.
Ouch! It's like put a sack of concrete on your head.
I know. We talked about that too. Not something you probably wear around every day in your leisure, but it reiterates that David wore it on his head. So we put it back in there. So here's our third negative that comes up. David calls for a census. And God's against census because that's not trusting him, it's trusting man. God wanted a census of all his fighting men. In fact, the Bible actually opens up this verse or this chapter. Satan entices David to get a census. It says Satan enticed him to do it. And good old Joab, remember Joab, he's the commander of David. And when we were going through Kings, we said he's the guy that kind of does... the end justifies the means. He'd go out and kill people we wanted to kill. He wasn't asked to kill. He shouldn't have killed. And then he all in all, it wasn't probably a bad thing because that person was bad, but he never went to God. He just did what he wanted to do. But in this case, I found it funny because all throughout Kings, you never see Joab going to the Lord in prayer. And he doesn't hear either, but he pushes back on David. He pushes back on David and says, why would we insult, the Lord our God with a census? He knows enough. He knows as commander, we should not be doing this. And David overrules him and tells him to go take it anyway. So he goes and takes the census, but he takes the census and he leaves out the Levites and the Benjamites. And it's interesting, once again, probably his political mind, the Benjamites is from Saul's tribe, right? And there's contention between David, the tribe of Judah, and the Benjamites. And so it explicitly says that Joab does not do the Levites, which is totally understandable because they can't fight, right? They can't own land and they can't go to battle because they're a priest. So he doesn't count them, which makes sense, but he doesn't count the Benjamites. And it doesn't really tell us why, but you can think the tension there. So he probably didn't count them, but he brings David the census back and stuff. Unfortunately, God did not tell him to do a census, and an angel of the Lord comes down and says there's going to be you have 3 options. This is the penalty for you doing this for your census. You can have 7 years of famine, 3 months to flee in your enemy, or 3 days of a plague brought on by the Lord. And David throws himself on the mercy of God and says, I'll do the plagues. And he doesn't say, I'll do the 3 days of plagues. He says, I'll throw myself on the mercy of God. Because he didn't want God used man to judge the nation of Israel. So you've got this angel, he has a plague. I thought I had how many died. Do I have how many died?
70,000.
70,000 people died in that 3-day plague. And what happens is, at the end of the 3-day plague, David sees the angel with his sword. So God used this angel, it's just on earth, we're seeing people die, or David is, from a plague. But at the end of it, David's eyes are open and he sees an angel with the sword causing the plague. And he pleads with God to stop the plague. He does a sacrifice. He buys a threshing floor. And there's this whole story between, he goes to the threshing floor and who's the person? Did I put it in the name of the person that he buys it from?
Yeah.
Yes,
Something like
he's gonna, and he wants to give it to David. And David said, no, I cannot take something free that I owe to the Lord. I'm gonna pay full price for it. He pays full price for it. He sacrifices it. He first, before he does that too, he pleads with God. He goes, all the people of Israel are not at fault. The census was my idea. Punish me and my family, not the whole nation. So he pleads that, and then he buys the threshing floor and makes a sacrifice. And when he does, the angel puts his sword down. So it talks about the story. Another glimpse into a human being, God supernaturally opening the eyes of the human being to see a spiritual realm. There's like 3 or 4 of these. Once again, if I could make a movie, or I even read a book, I would have all of those just boom, boom, boom as a miniseries, and all of these where God supernaturally opens the eyes of a human being to see this spiritual realm. So David does that. He sacrifices, and he's able to get the plague to stop. 22 got back to David preparing. This is where he's bringing all the materials down. He's prepping a lot of stuff. 22 talks all about David prepping for the temple. He goes to Solomon. He commands Solomon to follow God's plans. So a lot of the times in Kings, what we saw, even the good kings, when they were a good king, it never said anything about them raising their next generation, their children, to do right in the eyes of the Lord. David did it for Solomon. Solomon, when we read in Kings, we don't see Solomon doing it for his son, right? Jeroboam. We never saw, I said it wrong at the end, didn't I? Anyway, we never saw them, and that was the problem, is they did not pass God's truth on to the next generation. Sometimes we falter there as well, right? I tried to raise my kids in a godly house and in a godly way, but in retrospect, I wish I'd have done more. I suppose we all do, and we see that flaw in Kings, in Samuel and Kings. Raising your next kid is important to put them off on the right footsteps. So. Then we get to 23 through 26. We're still in the organizing. This is what I talked about, where David divides them up into. He first in chapter 23, he divides them by age and service. So the whole chapter is just written about this age group's going to do this role, this age group's going to do this service, and he breaks the services by age group all out. And then we go to chapter 24, and he says, okay, now I'm going to divide up these 24 divisions, and he takes them from the different families of the Levites. These are all descendants of Levi, but there's lots of different sons and sons under Levi, and they all have different responsibilities. And he does these 24 divisions, and I thought I had a note in there of how many. It was 24,000. 24 divisions of 24,000 each. I might be wrong on that number because I don't have a note on saying that. But he does it, and he says, okay, your 24 divisions here are going to serve for 1 week. And so that's basically almost 50, right? 52 weeks in a year. So every division serves about twice a year for a week. And then when they're not serving, they're just, they're either helping out or they're doing family duties and stuff like that. It's so that it doesn't put a burden on any one person. It divides out the burdens. And then 25 goes into, once again, who's going to sing, the magicians. All of this is set up before Solomon even starts. Solomon's just a little boy right now, and David's doing all this. It alludes to that Solomon was on David's hip, so Solomon saw this stuff, but David did all this, which is why a lot of people think this was actually David's temple. It was definitely David's heart. 27, David's officials and military organization. David's a very organized person, and that's part of the reason it made him a good warring king. He was very strategic and organized in his battles and stuff. And now it's going to show in his preparation. So 27 is once again all about structure and the divisions by tribe. Each tribe so each tribe had 24,000 men, 12 tribes for each division. So that's why I did put that note in later on. The officials oversaw the gathering of provisions, the taxation. You remember, why did we have a divided kingdom? Because of taxation, right? The temple was built, the palace was built after 20 years, but he continued to tax. And that burden of tax is what divided the kingdom in the end of Solomon's son. So, but it takes money to build a temple. It takes money to build a palace. And they had people that were overseers of taxation, of bringing in the provisions and the money and stuff for this. So, and then after that, we go to 28, and 28's all about David counseling Solomon. And this is what I was saying about raising your kids right. David now mentors, raises, focuses on Solomon so Solomon would follow in the ways of the Lord. And 28 emphasizes all of that about David giving the plans to Solomon, encouraging Solomon to follow God faithfully, and highlighting the importance of what the way to be a king, a godly king. So, and that's kind of 28, and then 29 is our last chapter in here. So we're going to end on time here. David in 29 is a prayer and a song. In fact, much of this prayer in 29 is a psalm. It ends up, a lot of the lines in this end up in David's psalms. So, David wrote a lot of the psalms, and when we go through the book of Psalms, we'll see how that breaks out, who wrote what psalms and stuff. Some of those psalms were written here in Chronicles in chapter 29, and he uses those. So anyway, so this is the last chapter, and it ends with this. And David is remember the purpose of Chronicles. So the purpose of Chronicles is you have these people that have been exiled for 70 years, and the writer is writing them this scroll to encourage them to come back, as we're going to see in Ezra, Nehemiah, the building of the wall, the building of the temple, the rebuilding of Jerusalem. They're being encouraged about their history in God, that God's favor of them, that they're still God's chosen people, and that kind of ends the Chronicles thought in ending this chapter 29 to encourage them, lifting them up and showing them how God has blessed them as a nation, right? That kind of encapsulates God blessing them as a nation, encouraging them to come back and to rebuild this torn down walls, torn down temple. And the last slide I have just kind of shows David on one side, Solomon on the other side, and First Chronicles on one side, Second Chronicles on the other, with the temple, the glue that holds these two together. When we go over next week, Second Chronicles, because it's just one book, but when we cover the second part of this on Second Chronicles, it's going to show the glue of what David's prep work and then Solomon's completing work, with God being the glue in the middle. God and the temple representing God's